The Oreshnik missile is something that Putin has been used as his sort of wonder weapon, if you like. Hypersonic, we're talking here traveling at really high speed, sort of 5,000 miles an hour. And the idea is that these things move so quickly that you can't knock them down. Well, the Oreshnik missile is something that Putin has been used as his sort of wonder weapon, if you like. Hypersonic, we're talking here traveling at really high speeds, sort of above sort of 5,000 miles an hour. And the idea is that these things move so quickly that you can't knock them down. However, this missile is really systematic of an awful lot of what we're seeing out of Russia. From what we understand, it doesn't hit its targets. It's an area weapon. And when you look at the sophistication, what we're seeing coming out of Ukraine, and the sophistication of cruise missiles like the Tomahawk missile that people will know very well about, these are capabilities that are landing on a pinhead, if you like. So their accuracy is within inches, not feet. So this great Russian weapon that, if it hits within a couple of kilometers of where it's intending to, then, that is a surprise. Often it's a lot more than that. From what we understand, the other element to it is that air defense, like Patriot, American Patriot missiles, they were being used in the first Gulf War when I was a tank commander, over 35 years ago. Now, these missiles, admittedly, they've been upgraded and modernized. They are knocking down Russia's hypersonic missiles. What we understand is that because of technology issues in Russia, a lot of these missiles still have Soviet era guidance systems, and these are hugely dated. A lot of them are sort of mandrolic, if you like, gyros, rather than relying on GPS and electronics. And it would appear that Russia has just not been able to update them. Many people believe the Oreshnik is still in its trial format, although Putin is trying to laud it as the weapon that is going to defeat Ukraine. Now, conversely, what we're seeing out of Ukraine, the innovation and the development of their own indigenous drones of all types, air, land, and sea, and missiles on a daily basis. Ukraine is striking targets, thousands of kilometers into Russia with great accuracy, and of course striking Moscow and St. Petersburg as well. Now, we've also noticed that Putin, he's been talking up the Oreshnik, but he hasn't dared really fire it at Kyiv because he knows that it's probably not going to get through and it's going to get shot down. So we know that the Russians are really struggling at the moment. We know that Putin is struggling, and lots of people in Russia are starting to question the whole way he's conducting the war very openly in the Russian press, which is almost unheard of. There are reports that Putin has barely been outside for months because he's terrified that some of these Ukraine assassination drones, if you like, are going to take him out. And Russian air defense is just not up to the game. Again, it's air defense, although we hear a lot about his S-300s and 400s being great. Well, they're not stopping drones and missiles hitting St. Petersburg and Moscow. And if Putin can't protect his two main cities, then the rest of the Russia is pretty much open. So I think the Oreshnik is systematic of where Russia is. A lot of talk, but a lot of old kit that they can't modernize. And as we're seeing, even on the battlefield in Ukraine, control of the electromagnetic spectrum is absolutely fundamental to doing business. And on the one hand, you have Ukraine, he's fighting this very autonomous warfare with electronics and with a few people. Whereas you see the Russian army still relying on masses of manpower, chucked into the meat grind, if you like, barely trained conscripts who are they're still losing 1,000 people a day. The Russians are fighting the First World War, if you like, whereas Ukraine is fighting sort of Star Wars. And the fact that Ukraine is so much smaller and so much less military resource from Russia, we're really seeing that this type of warfare is the way to defeat Russia. And which is why it's so frustrating when we talk about the defense investment plan and strategic defense review in the UK. This is exactly what we are trying to get to, but one needs investment to do it. But the investment we know will be so worthwhile because we will be able to overmatch the Russians. So I think in sum, this Russian missile really shows us the state of the Russian military and the state of Putin's leadership at the moment. It's built on not solid foundations. There's an awful lot of rhetoric, propaganda, and disinformation, but actually hard military power. We are all seeing that as far as Russia's concerned, that's pretty much on the wane. Hopefully, the sanctions are really hurting. We know that the Russians were getting electronics from the Chinese, but it appears that maybe that is sort of driving out. But the sort of innovation to develop and all the rest of it, these big missiles and the technology to deal with it is, it's sort of really old school sort of stuff. And you can imagine, Russian rocket scientists sat in buildings deep into Russia trying to work out how to do things. Whereas the converse, you've got bright young Ukrainians who are, AI enhanced, AI savvy electronic geniuses who are getting around things. And it seems slightly surprising that the Russians haven't managed to put some AI enhanced navigation system into these missiles already. I mean, we are well into the 5th year of this warfare. And when you think the technology leaps that Ukraine's making, and then you look at Russia, I mean, it's just not a competition at all. You've got Premier League and you got sort of 4th or 5th division when it comes to the Russians. So I think it's systematic of a whole host of things: sanctions, running out of money, and not having the innovation and ideas that Ukraine seems to be able to develop and make the most of. When you're manufacturing sophisticated military weaponry, quality is really everything. Again, it's systematic that the Russians have relied on quantity or mass of everything, be it tanks. They've lost over 6,500 tanks. Soldiers, they've lost over 1.5, or some people are saying 1.8 million soldiers. It's all mass. And again, when it comes to weaponry, the idea seems to be is get as much of it out of as you can, and don't worry too much about the quality. Well, it's if the quality, if it doesn't work, it's not worth having. It's no good buying a Ferrari, but then not buying the engine that goes in it, sort of thing. So, I mean, I think this is systematic of Russia. It's also systematic of the Russian leadership. Putin is an autocratic leader in classic Russian dictators. He rules absolutely. He is like an Iranian supreme leader. Nobody questions him because they're worried of sort of Stalin type purges. That where anybody who didn't agree was taken out, and that is the sort of position that Russia is in, and the Kremlin's in, and Putin's in. Putin knows that if he flinches at all, that's him. He's not going to go and have a quiet retirement with Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator who's now sitting in a dacha in Moscow. Putin knows he's going to be offered a balcony as his best option to sort of jump off. So it's systematic, I think, everything that is happening. And what we're seeing, although mass has always been important in warfare, the way that Ukraine's generating mass through autonomous vehicles and smart electronic warfare seems to be allowing them to prevail. And if Russia is being bled dry, and it seems that the people of Russia are now sort of at last realizing that, and it will be, Putin is perhaps in a position or feeling in a position, certainly the mood music coming out of Russia, that he's fairly soon going to try and sue for some sort of peace. And let us hope that Ukraine gets the just peace that it deserves, because we're in a very different situation now than we were when Putin and Trump met in Alaska the last time there were serious peace talks. And let's hope that Trump realizes that when he turns his focus away from the Middle East to something else. This wonder weapon, hypersonic, unstoppable missile, is not. And because Putin's put so much store on it, even his most avid supporters are now realizing that, it is really the emperor's new clothes. Putin, his rhetoric is becoming more desperate, and less people are believing it. So, yeah, it is probably it is a symbol of the demise, I think, of Putin and the demise of the Russian military. And let's hope that demise happens quickly, so the killing can stop on both sides, and we can get peace. Because this war has now gone on longer than the First World War. The casualty rates for the Russians are as high as the First World War, and the Russians are still fighting it as though it was the First World War. And unless things stop, the casualty rates are going to continue, in the thousands and the hundreds of thousands, and it seems completely unnecessary. It is just the desire of President Putin to try and rebuild the old Soviet Union, and that is absolutely clear to everybody except him, is not going to happen. So as soon as it stops, the better for everybody. Perhaps not Putin, but as an autocratic leader, he doesn't really care at what collateral damage he's creating around him. He knows that his own longevity, it depends on his success, and his success is looking less likely by the day. We know that they are probably running out of an awful lot of kit. Missiles have been, their weapon of choice. We don't know how many Oreshniks they've still got left. I'm sure that they will use whatever they've got, and we'll keep attacking. But it's clear that they are not being able to generate the type of capabilities that Ukraine is. I mean, Ukraine is making 4 million drones a year and exporting up to 50% of them. I'm sure if Russia was in that position, they'd be delighted. So, yeah, I think we are edging towards the end game, I expect. And all of us who've been following this so closely for over the last 4.5 years or so are desperate that the war does end, and we get a just peace, or Ukraine gets a just peace, and that is sort of looking more likely as it goes on. But Russia will keep attacking civilians until we have a ceasefire, no doubt. In theory, and Putin says this, he's just attacking military targets. And that's what the Oreshnik is designed for, to attack key military targets. But we've also seen that Russia just attacks civilians. We've seen that in Kyiv many times over the last few weeks. The amount of civilians attacked, even a major cathedral in Kyiv was attacked by the Russians, which is bizarre. Putin frames himself as this great Russian Orthodox churchman, and you would have thought somebody as sort of wedded to the church as Putin to actually attack another church is incongruous. But I saw it personally in Syria, where the Russians and the Syrians just attacked civilians. In fact, killed about 500,000 Syrian civilians, with the view that if you kill enough civilians, the rest will capitulate and surrender. That seems to be what the Russians are trying to do in Ukraine at the moment: kill civilians and hoping that they will then capitulate and surrender. Of course, Ukraine is a democratic country. It is not like an autocracy as Russia, and it is hardened the will of civilians, as we saw in the Second World War. So the fact that Oreshnik is not accurate and is killing civilians, I think doesn't really concern Putin one little bit. What does concern him is, I think, that people realize that actually Russian military technology is yesterday's news, and the longer this goes on, one anticipates the better Ukraine is going to be, and the more Russian infrastructure, critical national infrastructure, particularly its oil industry, is going to suffer. And there must become a time when the Russian coffers run out. And we understand that their economy is in free fall, and they are running out of money. And even Putin can't make tanks and bullets without currency. Well, I think as we've seen with the Iranian deal, I don't think nobody really thinks this is a great deal for anybody except perhaps the Iranians. But it is peace. The Straits of Hormuz are going to open, and that is really what is of great concern to most people in the world outside the Middle East. It is everybody is fully aware that the midterm elections are coming up at the in a few months towards the end of the year in the United States, and Putin and Trump knows that he's got to do well there. Otherwise, his term is going to come to a pretty rocky end. And it would seem that his popularity in the US at the moment is as low as it's ever been. But if he can get a just peace deal for Ukraine, and lots of Americans seem to be wanting that, then he could see that as a way to get back, his approval ratings and to do well in the midterms later this year. It seems to be acknowledgement at the G7 that Trump now accepts that actually things are slightly different, and the Ukrainians have done a fantastic job, and they deserve to get a just peace deal. So by putting the emphasis on Putin, then that makes it more likely. But I mean, we've got too used to Trump over the last sort of year or so of his second term, and what he says tomorrow is not necessarily what he says today is not necessarily what he does tomorrow.